So PAASE, or the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering, is an organization which consists of scientists and engineers of Filipino descent, initially in the U.S. and then the Philippines, but now um, we have other members from other countries as well. So for today, our webinar is entitled Current Trends in Carbon Emissions Pinch Analysis. Our speaker is a professor of chemical engineering and university fellow of De La Salle University and an academician of the Philippine National Academy of Science and Technology with more than 370 publications and an H index of 43 in the Scopus database. Based on Google Scholar citations, Professor Tan ranks among the top researchers in the world in the areas of process integration and process systems engineering. He received his bachelor's and master's degree in chemical engineering and his PhD in mechanical engineering from De La Salle University. He is editor-in-chief of Process Integration and Optimization for Sustainability by Springer Nature, subject editor of Sustainable Production and Consumption by Elsevier IChemE, and editorial board member of Clean Technologies and Environmental Policy of Springer Nature and Cleaner Engineering and Technology by Elsevier. He is a co-author of the books Process Integration Approaches to Planning Carbon Management Networks and Input-Output Models for Sustainable Industrial Systems. He is co-editor of the books Recent Advances in Sustainable Process Design and Optimization and Process Design Strategies for Biomass Conversion Systems. He has received multiple scientific awards from government and professional organizations in the Philippines. So without further ado, let us all welcome Professor Raymond Tan.
Thank you, Kay. Good morning and good evening to people in the audience. Let me just begin sharing my screen. Right. One of the good things about the silver lining of the current pandemic really is that public interest in science has really grown in appreciation of the need to provide scientific tools to problems that we face. My talk isn't going to be about COVID because I'm not an expert in that area. I'm talking about carbon emission analysis. And this is a topic which I've been working on for close to about 2 decades now. And it deals with a problem which was recognized by the scientific community for many decades. In fact, it was Svante Arrhenius recognized that CO2 in the atmosphere would elevate the temperature of the atmosphere by several degrees. This was about a century ago when the calculations were done. And it's only much more recently, I think after the turn of the 21st century, that public awareness of climate change became really mainstream, even though there are still pockets of climate change denial in different parts of the world. So I think it's essential that we recognize that carbon management is a very critical issue, and it's an issue which existed long before there was COVID. And believe me, it's an issue which many years or many decades after the vaccine for COVID is found, we will still be facing the climate problem. And for example, the polymath Raymond Dyson spoke of this in a 1977 paper published in Energy. My talk this morning, which I'd hope to go through it in less than 40 minutes, covers a brief overview of climate change from a global perspective. I'll talk about carbon emissions pinch analysis, starting with the genesis of this procedure, a brief tutorial, a scan of the literature, including papers done by researchers other than the team I'm involved in, and some of the work that I've been involved in as co-author, and some recent work I've been doing with different research groups throughout the world, and finally, of course, conclusions and research prospects. So I'll begin with an overview of the climate change problem. Climate action is one of the sustainable development goals, and it is absolutely incumbent upon us to take urgent action because it's a time-bound problem. And for instance, if you were to look at IPCC documents, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change provides regular updates on the state of climate. One of the things we've seen recently in their 2018 projection is the need to limit climate change or temperature rise by the end of this century to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and preferably closer to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that seems like such a small difference, but this will have 2 degrees will have a major impact on the way human civilization will progress. And anything above 2 degrees is probably going to be close to catastrophic for future generations. The problem with climate really and greenhouse gases is there's a very long lag time in the causality chain between having the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the actual radiative forcing which causes the temperature change. And this means that there's a window of time which is necessary to recognize if there is a need to limit the warming 80 years from now, by 2100. It's been estimated that by the middle of this century, which is 30 years from now, global net CO2 emissions should drop down to practically zero level. So it has to be done 50 years ahead of time for the climate stabilization to be felt decades thereafter. And if you think about it, hitting zero emissions in the span of about one generation is a major global challenge. It's such a major challenge that researchers, for example, Hazeldine and colleagues wrote a paper 2 years ago saying that these deep emissions cuts will only be possible with the large-scale use of carbon capture and storage technologies and carbon dioxide removal, as it's called by the IPCC, or negative emissions technologies. And essentially that means that we would need to accelerate the commercialization of these technologies, which are still in pilot plant or lab scale or even just conceptual scale as we speak now. One of the approaches that can be taken would be the so-called Princeton wedges approach or technology wedges approach. And this diagram, what you would see is this rainbow-like diagram shows along the horizontal axis. We have time projecting all the way to the middle of this century, and the vertical axis would be annual global CO2 emissions measured in gigatons per year. And as you can see, the upper edge of this trajectory shows us business as usual. So if we were not to make any major technological and lifestyle changes, by the middle of the century, we would have global emissions amounting to about 60 gigatons per year. As I've just said, what we actually need to stabilize climate is to go in the opposite direction to get to zero by 2050. And it stands to reason that rather than assuming that there's one silver bullet that will allow this drastic cut to be achieved, it's probably more realistic to assume that we would need to pick different technologies and maximize their use and get cumulative emissions reductions by combining all of them wherever they're suitable to be deployed based on geographic conditions or economic conditions. And with optimal deployment of technologies like CCS, energy efficiency enhancements in industry, in buildings and in houses, improvement of fuel efficiency and negative emissions technologies, all put together, potentially they can be scaled up to achieve zero emissions by 2050. All right, so that is the background as far as climate change is concerned. I'm going to talk about carbon emissions pinch analysis, or SEPA. This is a modeling framework for optimal carbon constraint allocation of energy streams to match them with different energy demands or energy sinks, given that each of the sinks will have carbon constraints. This is a modeling framework that can be applied at different scales. ranging from an industrial plant to an entire country or even a cluster of countries like the EU or Southeast Asia. And I will stress one thing. SEPA is a modeling framework. This is best explained. I would refer, for example, to the SEIR models, which have become very popular nowadays in doing pandemic modeling. There is a difference between a modeling framework, which is like a template for computations, as opposed to a specific working model. And what you do is, if you have a modeling framework, you start populating it with numerical values of case-specific coefficients, and then you have a working model. So what SEPA actually is a modeling framework, and you can use it in different contexts by just using the appropriate numbers. So this is more about how to calculate rather than the specific results of the calculations. The genesis of SEPA can be traced back to chemical engineering. I am a chemical engineer by training, and one thing I was never taught back in my university days is something that I can say in just a few seconds. Chemical engineering is engineering for the mass production of chemicals. That is the fundamental problem that we all face. And chemical engineering is called engineering simply because the problem of mass production involves not just forming a specific molecule, which is your product. Think, for example, if you're making ethanol. When you mass produce, it's also essential that you have all of these purification steps, because you need to purify the product to a certain level of quality that is required by the market. And when you have all of these purification steps, you have what are called utilities, because you need energy, you need water to ensure that these various preliminary steps at the core of the process are able to be done on a large scale. So energy is a major factor in industrial plants, as is the use of water streams and such. And because of the need for utilities, one branch of chemical engineering known as process integration emerged back in the 1970s. And for those of you who are old enough to have been alive back in the 1970s, one of the major changes was there were a couple of energy crises, one in 1973 and the other 1979. And what happened was there was a sudden jump in the global price of energy, which acted as impetus for industrial plants and for energy intensive companies to look for ways to economize on a major cost, business cost, which is fuel cost. So process integration was a branch of chemical engineering which is dedicated to developing design tools or algorithms to allow companies to either build more efficient plants or to take the existing plants and modify those so they consume less fuel. And this was in the 1970s. In the ensuing decades, what happened was there's plenty of progress towards applying those same principles. If you can save on fuel, just by modifying those principles, you could potentially save on other things that your plants need, whether it's water, solvents, even some people have used these principles for optimizing the flow of financial resources. And in process integration, the major methodologies which emerged, initially these were seen as being competitors. One is pinch analysis, which is based on the use of insights and simple graphical displays, similar to what economists would use for reasoning. And on the other hand, you'd have groups working with mathematical programming, which are equation-based models, which once they get to the point where you have tens of thousands of equations, might actually be quite black box in nature. Fortunately, in recent years, these two schools of thoughts have made friends with each other, and there's been more synergy in the research community. Now, in pinch analysis, specifically, the general roadmap for pinch analysis is we begin with what is known as a process flow diagram, which is a schematic representation of an industrial plant. And pinch analysts would extract highlights of the data that are needed. For example, if you're dealing with energy conservation, you would probably need temperature data and enthalpy data. And we construct what are known as composite curves, which summarize the cumulative demands of energy and cumulative supply that are available inside the plant. And the pinch analysis procedure culminates in what is called network design. In other words, you then map out if there are pockets of excess energy in the industrial plant. These are matched with the appropriate pockets of energy demands internally, because if you can do this, if you can use waste energy that is available in your plant and supply energy to demands inside the plant, you can buy less fuel, and you would in fact save on costs. You would actually reduce emissions. This was recognized back in the early 90s that there's a link between the emissions reduction and the fuel consumption reduction. Now, that then brings us to SEPA specifically. This is a procedure that I co-developed with a good friend, a longtime collaborator, who's in the audience now, Professor Dominic Foo of the University of Nottingham. This is the actual picture taken back in 2005. We were in Kota Kinabalu in Malaysia discussing the initial concept. The paper was published in Energy in 2007. It has come quite a long way. There's another picture on the slide with Dominic giving a talk at an International Energy Agency workshop some 3 years ago in Berlin. And what we did essentially in our article, which has also been rehashed in the Handbook of Process Integration and in encyclopedias, we've taken the general principles of pinch analysis, and instead of applying them to energy conservation, we applied them to a specific problem of matching energy sources with energy demands based on carbon emissions considerations. And we never really thought, between the two of us, I don't think either of us thought it would get this big 15 years later. The seminal paper has been cited over 200 times. Those papers which cited us have cumulatively had about 5,000 citations and growing by the day. One thing I would say is there's been plenty of recognition from the Institution of Chemical Engineers, or ICHEME, which is a UK-based global organization of chemical engineers. We were featured in the Chemical Engineer magazine in late 2019. One of the things I would recommend for the audience, because a few weeks ago, the ICHEME published an online collection of climate change papers. 31 papers in total, which are available for free. I don't know how long they'll remain open access, but one of those 31 papers is our 2016 review paper, which you can then, if you're interested, you can download. There's a bit of a tutorial aspect to that paper. Of course, it's about half a decade past state of the art, but it's a pretty good milestone in the SEPA literature. And of course, more recently, Dominic and I published a book which was released a few months ago. This is, I would have to say, Dominic did a lot more work on this book than I did. But the other thing is, in addition to the tutorial, the second half of the book features contributions, contributed chapters by different research teams in China, in Taiwan, in India, and other countries who have used this same procedure for local problems. So I'd urge you to have a look at that. We can't give it away for free, but we can do a book signing if you would like that. All right, now that's enough advertising. Let's move on to the discussion or the tutorial aspect of this webinar. Carbon emissions pinch analysis starts with the problem of having, as you see on screen, we would have a set of energy sources and a set of energy demands. And as with, this might look a bit like a neural network. And by analogy, what you might be doing is figuring out the weights of those arcs that connect a given source to a given sink. And for each of the sources, you would have a supply limit, how much of a particular fuel or energy source is available to be distributed, and what is its carbon intensity. At the demand side, we would have similar data. How much does each of the sinks require in terms of energy, and does it have a carbon emissions cap? And based on this information, we would then match the sources in the sinks. And typically in pinch analysis, we would have what we call the fresh resource. And that means that there's a very clean energy source which is potentially available, let's say solar energy or wind energy. But what you're trying to do is trying to make the most of what's already available, existing as energy sources, while satisfying all of the demands in terms of energy flow and in terms of carbon caps. So that is the fundamental problem. What we make use of is the so-called pinch diagram. This is an example of a pinch diagram which has been solved, and the procedure begins by plotting cumulative energy flow along the horizontal axis and cumulative carbon emissions along the vertical axis. So this is the geometric representation, and an optimal solution exists and is signified by this geometric orientation where the energy sources, which is the red, this is known as a composite curve, even though it's actually a series of linear segments. So the red segment, relative to the blue segment, which corresponds to the demands, would have this orientation. And what that means is you are able to satisfy the energy demand without crossing the blue line or without exceeding the carbon emissions cap. Typically, what happens in an energy system is that there exists a pinch point, a point of tangency between the two composite curves, as shown here. And that pinch point has very important properties. There's a principle which has been used for many decades now in various pinch applications, which says very simply that you can decompose a complex problem, and you would have this bubble shows us that there's a region below the pinch point and to the left. The other bubble shows us a region above and to the right of the pinch point. And one of the interesting consequences of all pinch analysis problems is that these two subproblems can be treated completely independently of each other. And it applies to any problem framed as pinch analysis. In the case of carbon emissions pinch analysis, this is the classical case study in our 2007 paper, which was actually based on the data of the Philippines early in this century. So this is cumulative energy demand measured in thousands of terajoules, and the vertical axis would be CO2 emissions. And what we did back then was we segmented the Philippines just as an approximation into Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, these being the demands. And the energy sources would be fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, with the potential of introducing a larger quantity of what we referred to initially as zero carbon energy. We didn't define that explicitly back then, but zero carbon could be nuclear energy, it could be tidal or wind energy. And if, hypothetically, if you were to set specific carbon caps for each of the three geographic regions, then the problem would be, how would you allocate the available energy sources so that none of the carbon caps of the three regions would be exceeded? And this is the pinch diagram showing the optimal solution. What would happen is you would try to maximize use of the available resources initially, but typically it would not be possible to satisfy the carbon caps without introducing more of this new zero carbon resource. And the actual quantity required can be calculated via this horizontal gap that we see down here. So this would be, for example, additional nuclear energy or additional solar power generation. And likewise, in order to meet the carbon caps, some of the pre-existing fuel or energy capacity would actually have to be mothballed. And in this case, you would note that there's a bit of an overhang here in the red bubble on my screen. Now, what we would see is I've enclosed the region above the pinch in this red diagonal oval. And in the source sink diagram, it actually corresponds to these same red bubbles. And that means that one of the consequences that we should highlight is what is known as the golden rule of pinch analysis. Simply put, it says that once you've found the pinch point, you should not be transferring energy across the pinch point. And what that means as a consequence is we would note that coal as a fuel is located above the pinch point. All of the coal has to be used only in the region which is located above the pinch point. And likewise, once we begin putting in new renewable energy or nuclear energy capacity, this should only be used below the pinch point, and specifically in regions 1 and 2. And we don't use this in region 3, which is across the pinch point. What that means is you can actually cross the pinch point, but the solution would not be optimal. So that is the golden rule of pinch, and that is what SEPA does. The same procedure, the graphical display is very useful for discussion and education purposes and communication, but we've actually taken up these same principles and implemented it as an algebraic algorithm and as a mathematical program in subsequent papers published a little bit more than a decade ago. We've also much more recently used process graph algorithms to implement carbon emissions pinch analysis with some interesting results. What we've also done is we've applied exactly the same principles, but you can measure how sustainable an energy source is, typically using carbon emissions, but you could use other metrics as well, like land footprint, water footprint, and others. So applying pinch principles, but replacing carbon footprint with some other footprint appears to work. We've done it, for example, about 12 or 13 years ago, at the height of the biofuel mania that took over the world for some time. We did this for land footprint and for water footprint, which are constraints for the production of biofuels. Much more recently, we decided we could actually approximate sustainability with a composite index and use a weighted average index of different sustainability measures and use this within pinch analysis. This was selected as the best paper by the editors of Clean Technologies and Environmental Policy 3 years ago. Right, the next thing I'll do is I'll give a brief overview of global CEPA literature. These are some of the papers that I have not been involved in, but have been done by researchers in different countries. So certainly, it was just 1 year after the initial publication of our paper that at a conference we found out, Dominic and I found out, that there was a PhD student in Ireland who was presenting at the same conference as us, who'd taken up our algorithm as part of his PhD thesis. Damien Crilly did that. At the same time, at the same event, I ran into a postdoc by the name of Martin Atkins, who struck up a conversation with me about pinch analysis, and they came up with their own analysis of New Zealand's low carbon future using this technique. And of course, colleagues in the US, in China, in Brazil, India, these are very large countries which would figure prominently in the global carbon footprint of the future. And much more recently, of course, research teams in Korea, Nigeria, the Baltic states, and earlier this year, a paper came out in the Journal of Cleaner Production doing this for the entire EU. Now, some of the work that I've been involved in, and Dominic Foo as well, with our colleague Jia Xiaoping from China, is the analysis of some local issues. China, of course, is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, just by sheer scale of the country. And we've worked on how to decarbonize parts of the Chinese economy, including power generation, including waste management, and the use of excess biomass from farms. Much more recently, we've worked with a colleague who's based in the United Arab Emirates, Rebecca Lim, who's based in UAE, started doing analysis of the UAE low carbon future using this technique. And the thing about UAE is it's a small country, but has the unique characteristic of having very high per capita carbon intensity. So that was a big issue. The other issue is being in an arid part of the world, there's an important trade-off between the carbon emissions and the water footprint. especially because a lot of their municipal water supply is provided via desalination, which itself is extremely energy intensive. So that's an interesting paper that you may want to have a look at. Closer to home, of course, with some colleagues, including our host, Dr. Kay, and my with Dominic as well. We've done an analysis of the Philippine commitment to the Paris Accord. And if you're not familiar with what the Philippines has committed, back in 2015, the Philippines promised conditional 70% reduction in CO2 emissions relative to business as usual, which is approximately 2/3 of the carbon intensity relative to GDP. And what we've done is we've taken pinch analysis and we've figured out, given the current state of technology, it might be feasible to get halfway there. With some economic restructuring, we can do 30% carbon emissions intensity reduction. Anything beyond this will require dramatic changes in technology. For instance, it may require negative emissions technologies to be implemented to get anywhere near 70% reduction. And the commitment, mind you, the commitment is for 2030, which is just a decade from now. And much more recently, of course, we've done parallel analysis of the Philippines and Malaysia, which are published by the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute. I believe these are available for a free download. If anyone in the audience is interested in these, you just visit their website. Now, as we approach the end of the webinar, I just want to talk briefly about some of our recent work with different research teams throughout the world. This is work done at the scale of industrial plants. And this is actually done primarily by Jane Yap and our colleague, Dr. Julie Tan, completely unrelated, but with the same surname. Jane Yap was a high-performance undergraduate student at UCSI University from Kuala Lumpur. And she got a BASF scholarship to do a few months of research attachment in Sweden under Dr. Stavros. And what we did was we came up with an extension of a technique previously developed in an earlier 2010 paper by Dominic's graduate student, which has to do with carbon footprint reduction in an industrial plant. And this is really an allocation problem in the sense that it's easy to imagine that an industrial plant would have CO2 emissions and carbon footprint. But typically, if you have multiple products which you're selling to different customers, there is actually the problem of allocating the total carbon footprint to each of these product streams without double counting and without undercounting. And this is essential because in the accounting procedure for carbon footprint, whichever firm eventually buys your product, your carbon footprint as allocated to this product becomes part of the carbon footprint of the downstream product. And the problem then is you begin redesigning plants to achieve reduced carbon emissions. What are the best measures to take, considering that the carbon footprint is going to be shared by the multiple products that you're making? And Jane did some very nice analysis of biorefinery based on what is known in Sweden as growth, which is branches and leaves from trees that is used as biomass feedstock. So this illustrates the use of SEPA methodology at the scale of industrial plants. Next, and much more recent work done by PhD student Rok Gomilchek and colleague Dr. Lidia Čuček and a research team from University of Maribor in Slovenia. Rok is actually employed by the largest aluminum producer in Slovenia. And what we've started to do as part of his PhD work is an analysis of how to reduce the carbon footprint of aluminum products. If you're familiar with the procedure or the process for production of primary aluminum, it is primarily an electrolytic process. And that means that you use electricity to break down the aluminum oxide molecule, and you get, on one hand, you get the oxygen, and then of course you have the metallic aluminum. And this is extremely energy intensive. It is possible in the EU, especially for energy intensive industries like this, that you can actually select where you purchase your electricity so that a company can certify reductions in carbon footprint by selectively buying electricity, let's say, that is certified to be renewable or certified to be low carbon. Except that this will be more expensive, and thus the problem is, how do you reduce the carbon emissions, the carbon footprint of your aluminum product while meeting the budget constraints as well? So this is interesting work which is still developing as Rock progresses through his PhD work. And in terms of the global scale, 2 years ago I did some work with a research team based primarily in the Czech Republic. This is led by Dr. Tim Walmsley, who's now back in the University of Waikato in New Zealand. And what we were interested in was to look at a concept called circular economy, which is very popular nowadays. It deals with closing the loop at grand scales so that we use resources more efficiently. And our idea back then, primarily Tim's idea, was how do we use the pinch analysis principles so that we're able to plan these circular economies much more effectively. And we looked at the case of what happens when you have biomass-based systems like pulp and paper manufacture, which would have plenty of residues with potential to be used either as fuels themselves or to be used as feedstocks to make green fuels. And we looked specifically at using residual biomass from the pulp and paper industry and looked at how much of this is available on a global scale, and hypothetically looking at the potential to scale up the production of green aviation fuel derived from these residues. Now, we looked at aviation specifically because of its inherent decarbonization constraints. What I mean is it is highly plausible that within the next quarter of a century, we're going to have a dramatic drop in number of fossil fuel or internal combustion engine powered vehicles. It's plausible that the next car I buy might actually be either a hybrid or a pure electric vehicle. And there are countries in the EU and formerly in the EU that are actually planning to phase out gasoline or diesel powered cars in the near future. So when it comes to ground-based transport, there is a potential for very deep electrification and decarbonization. Sadly, this is not the case for aviation. It's going to take a long way and plenty of technological breakthroughs before we have electric aircraft. So really the only way to have deep decarbonization in aviation is to have biofuels with very low or near zero carbon footprints. And in this paper, we calculated that the global potential to cut aviation carbon emissions just using biomass as a feedstock is about 30%, 37%. Now, whether this can be achieved remains to be seen, but I think one of the lessons that we can take from pinch analysis is it's important to know what your budget is. In other words, it's important to recognize that theoretical limit that you can aspire for, whether you're trying to cut carbon emissions or trying to cut your carbon or land or water footprint. The theoretical limit acts as a guide for all of those decisions to be made later on in once you get to detailed planning and detailed design. So I'll move towards the end of this webinar, this talk, by discussing some current work in progress, which I opted not to present. Dominic Foo and I have been involved with a colleague from UK in the University of Nottingham on analyzing the feasibility of UK's zero carbon emissions target by the middle of this century. And that manuscript has been submitted to a journal. It's under peer review. There's also work that I'm doing with a local colleague, Dr. Neil Lopez, and with Dominic as well, looking at electricity trading in Southeast Asia. And this is interesting work which will be presented in a conference a couple of months from now. Maybe a future webinar can be done based on that. Much more recently, Dominic Foo recruited a PhD student to work on analyzing how negative emissions technologies can be integrated within the procedure, because we see some of the recent work has shown that it's a lot of the deep emissions cuts that we're looking at cannot be achieved unless we have negative emissions as part of the global energy economy. And I mentioned that there's work I'm doing with colleagues in Slovenia looking at the circular economy of the aluminum industry. And my current pet project, I'd be happy to work with anyone who's interested in game theory. How do we link this pinch analysis with game theory, allocate carbon emissions caps to different countries or different regions? So in conclusion, carbon emissions pinch analysis is a modeling framework for managing carbon emissions at scales ranging from industrial plants all the way to entire continents. There is still plenty of work to be done. We're looking at how pinch analysis can be linked with game theory, as I've just mentioned, perhaps artificial intelligence tools. A colleague at the University of Swinburne in Malaysia has come up with the idea of using artificial intelligence and linking it with pinch analysis. This is still under development with Dr. Haobing Shen. And of course, applying the technique in its mature form towards current carbon management issues, and it's actually essential. And what we're seeking right now is to get a more mainstream audience for this highly specialized planning tool. And thus, to end this webinar, I just want to say deep thanks to my colleague for 2 decades now, Dominic Foo. This is certainly work that has come a long way. My other collaborators who worked with me on pinch analysis and its different variants throughout the world, and of course the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering for this opportunity to give this talk. So thank you, and now I would be happy to take questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much for that interesting talk. Okay, so for our participants, again, you can type in your questions in the chat box. So we have several questions coming from the YouTube account. So let's begin with the one posted by Al Serafica. Can you do pinch analysis on the rate of COVID-19 infection and healthcare capacity of the country?
Good morning, Al. That's a great question. And the reason it's a great question is it's something Dominic and I have actually started to discuss. I think it was about 6 weeks ago that we started to discuss how to match the different demands, which would be, for example, patients. These could be at the level of cities. And then the resources might actually be, for example, they could be the medication or the capacity of the hospitals. So the answer is yes, it can be done in principle. We started to do it, but unfortunately it got buried in a lot of the other work, which we've continued, of course, with the actual core scientific work that we've been doing. But I think with that reminder, we might have an interesting discussion in the next few days. Thanks for that. Yes, that can be done.
Okay, the next question comes from Angeline Lau. Does SEPA consider changes of carbon emission with respect to time? How can the time aspect be integrated?
Very much so, yes. It's a bit complicated. It's something that we probably would not be able to do in a webinar of 45 minutes. But the best work in this area has been done by our colleagues down in New Zealand, a team led by Professor Michael Walmsley. And they've had a series of papers that looked at the carbon emissions pinch analysis. You would imagine a series of snapshots of these diagrams progressing over the years or over the decades. And the temporal aspect is done by having these series of progressive reductions in carbon footprint over a period of several decades. So it can be done sequentially, and in fact is the right way to do it.
Okay, thank you. We have another one from, okay, yeah, it's a continuation of Dr. Angeline Lau's question. So how would you compare SEPA and process graphs?
Well, we have an actual paper on this which maps in a very precise way the standard source sink problem, which can be solved by pinch analysis, and with the process graphs. So I think, well, I'm not going to answer by going through the procedure because that'll take us a couple of hours to do it, but I can highlight why you might want to do it with process graphs. Okay, pinch analysis begins with the principle that whatever problem you deal with, it's important to know what your feasible budget is. Actually, the term we use in the research community is what is known as a target. But to a layperson, essentially it functions as a budget. This is what you can work with. And then there are different heuristics and different principles that we apply so that we can design a network which is within the budget. Now, what can be done in process graph, and we've proven it in a pretty well-cited 2017 paper, is the emphasis is a bit different. When you do a process graph, the emphasis lies in enumeration of options. And of course, it still calculates what the target is, except it's not the core of the solution procedure. The core is the enumeration of these options. And I would say the advantage of doing the process graph route is that once you have the budget, the actual problem is how do you apply the budget to a design? And process graph could give you a list of options if you happen to have a problem with multiple optima. And there are many problems with an infinite number of optimal solutions, then process graph would be able to enumerate each and every one of these. And the other point with process graphs, which is always very interesting from the engineering standpoint, is that when you solve a model and solve for the mathematical optimum, and suppose the mathematical optimum is 1,000, most algorithms would be unable to detect what are known as near optimal solutions. And suppose then that your optimum, which is 1,000, and your near optimal solution is 1,000.1. So with this minuscule difference of 1% of 1%, your second solution is actually non-optimal from the mathematical standpoint. But from the engineering standpoint, it might in fact be worth exploring because that 1% of 1% disadvantage might actually disappear once you build the system in real life. And it's process graph which is able to explore all of these different alternatives and do it algorithmically in a way that doesn't miss any of the options. So what we've done in our paper is bring the best of both worlds into the literature. So thanks for the question.
Okay, I think Joel Coelho has a question.
Yes, thank you. Raymond, I have to congratulate you and Professor Foo for developing this optimization/planning method that really is quite powerful and is applied on many areas. But I really like that original application that you have in terms of energy allocation that is carbon constrained. And I appreciate that paper that you published in Energy, I think in 2007, regarding the Philippines. And I would submit that it's high time to update that. So as many of you know, the energy consumption in Southeast Asia doubled from 1995 to 2005. And then it's expected to double again by 2040. And it's increasing at an annual rate of about 4%. And it's going about twice as fast as the rest of the world. And the Philippines is very much a part of Southeast Asia. And the Philippines at this time is not fully industrialized yet. And in fact, we are promoting the industrialization of the country. So the country is really facing a very tough situation in terms of, one is having the energy that's needed for industrialization. The other one is having to for it to be constrained properly in terms of CO2 emission. So I really think that it's very important to use this this optimization/planning method for the Philippines, and even not just with Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, but in specific regions as well. Considering that the Philippines has solar, has wind, has geothermal, but of course predominantly it's still using coal and oil. So it's more of a remark rather than a question, but I really would urge you to communicate with the Department of Energy in the Philippines to apply this methodology in terms of its planning for energy allocation in the country. So I guess that's the question. Have you had a chance to have a conversation or interaction with the Philippine Department of Energy regarding this?
Thanks very much for that comment. It's close to a decade ago that I gave a similar talk, and I had an official from the Department of Energy in the audience. So there was some interest, and unfortunately, he ended up resigning a couple of weeks after my talk. But I think we would have to revisit that. My comment regarding the Philippine energy outlook is that number one, we are signatories to the Paris Accord, and the deep emissions cuts that we promised back in 2015, I mean, 70% relative to the business as usual trajectory is very deep. Nevertheless, that is actually proportionate to what the entire world needs by way of cuts. So if you were to view it that way, it's proportionate to, if everyone were to do that, if every country were to do that, we would meet the target of 75% global emissions cuts. Nevertheless, there's always that ethical issue and political issue of historical emissions, because countries, for instance, like the US or the European Union would have been historically responsible for much of the emissions that are causing the impacts that we're feeling now. And that the argument that China's always been making is we may be the largest emitter of CO2 emissions now, but this is only in recent years. We have limited historical emissions. And the same can be said for the Philippines. So I would say, I'm not a politician, but I would say from a scientific standpoint, what we need to do is have a look at what we can feasibly commit by way of carbon emissions cuts, because we can't just say we don't want to participate in this. I think it's a global burden. It's a burden that will be borne by our children and grandchildren, and thus it's incumbent upon us in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia that we take up our share. On the other hand, of course, because as a developing country, there's a rapid expansion. The economy has been growing until recently at 6-7% per year, with proportionate growth in CO2 emissions, of course, and energy demand. It would be necessary to explore different alternatives. There has been plenty of discussion, which is still ongoing locally, about whether we should have nuclear energy. I think that needs to be strongly considered as part of the mix. The option which has not been discussed yet would be negative emissions. And what that means is not so much CO2 sequestration. The Philippines is in a highly seismically active part of the world, and I don't think it's feasible to sequester CO2 at scale, because if you sequester it and you have an earthquake at a particular site, you waste all of that effort in capturing the CO2 to begin with. But there are options which are still at the conceptual or pilot scale level. For example, biochar-based sequestration of carbon. I had a PhD student do very good work. She's now with the University of Santo Tomas, by the way, doing biochar application in agricultural land as a way of doing large-scale carbon sequestration. And much more recently, something called enhanced weathering, which is you could take minerals which naturally occur, and through normal weathering processes, they would slowly sequester carbon from the atmosphere. So enhanced weathering simply means you find these minerals or rocks, one of which is basalt. And basalt is commonly used as a concrete aggregate additive. It dissolves very slowly in rainwater and captures CO2 in the process. If you were to pulverize the basalt to the fineness of flour, for example, and apply to agricultural lands, you can accelerate this capture process and get negative emissions in principle. So that remains to be proven in the field. But I do think the reason Dominic recruited his PhD student, Puru, to work on negative emissions is we realized as we were writing the book, it looks like there's no way to meet the zero emissions unless we think out of the box.
Thank you very much for that.
Thanks.
Okay, so now I'll take in some questions from our participants here at Zoom. So the first one comes from Jason Umpeng. So the construction industry contributes a lot of carbon emissions worldwide and locally from our Build program. Are there people working on carbon emissions focusing on construction industry using CEPA? What are the probable research topics and tracks that can actually be explored?
I see. Thanks for that question, Jason. My colleague Jason is a civil engineer, and we've started using pinch analysis recently for financial analysis of projects. But the point about carbon emissions of construction is interesting. I see it primarily as a supply chain problem. In other words, you would have all of the materials that you need, which would include Portland cement and steel and other minor materials, which would be produced in plants all over the world. They would be transported to where they're used. And then you'd have the emissions taking place during the actual construction of specific infrastructure or buildings. And it would begin, I would say, with some kind of a life cycle analysis of the different steps. And I would map these within a pinch diagram and then figure out what are the actual technological options, because pinch analysis is a macro level tool. You would need those building blocks to begin with for decarbonization. And what pinch analysis can help you with is how do you use all of these little tools that you have and put them together to solve the big problem. Now, the other point about the construction industry that needs to be emphasized is even though it is a large contributor to carbon footprint, it is actually not a step function type of contribution, but it's temporary in the sense that as a country urbanizes, it saturates eventually. And I'll use China as an example as well. During the rapid industrialization and urbanization of China, which has happened in the past generation, plenty of concrete and steel has been put in place with all the resulting carbon footprint just to build up the infrastructure, just to build up and modernize the country. But that eventually self-saturates, because once you put in enough concrete to have all of these mega cities, then your carbon emissions curves, initially you're arcing upwards as you're building up. But once you saturate your country and you have enough cities, then that tapers off. So it's actually not a steady state kind of emissions, but emissions that you generate while achieving a transition from one state to the other. So that brings in a second temporal aspect of the analysis, which I think, and I actually think this would be interesting strategic work for a graduate student. And yeah, we can discuss offline some of the details if you want. Thanks for that question.
Okay, I'll take another question from the YouTube channel. This one comes from JJ Joaquin. Given that carbon emissions are fuzzy, how do you determine the threshold pinch?
Interesting, yeah. Thanks, JJ. Some of the information used in pinch analysis are deterministic or near deterministic. In other words, for instance, there would be very little margin of uncertainty as how much emissions you would generate from burning a specific amount of natural gas or a specific amount of oil to supply a particular requirement. So to some extent, many of the components of the typical carbon emissions pinch problem are not quite perfectly deterministic. And I would say they're slightly stochastic because there are variations from location to location. So the point of fuzziness is interesting because we just spoke of speculative ideas, which are partly geoengineering and partly negative emissions. Like what happens if you use enhanced weathering, the basalt example I showed earlier about using pulverized minerals to capture CO2. And we know from the analysis of the chemical reactions involved that these actually will work in real life. We don't know for sure to what extent it will work because you never get pure chemicals in real life. So the fuzziness comes into play in the epistemic uncertainty that is always encountered when you have a new idea which potentially could be a technology in the near or medium term future, but there is no historical data as yet to figure out how it will actually perform in real life once you start using it. And it's an interesting gamble because in practice, for example, if DOST or in Malaysia, MOST were to invest R&D funds in a technology for which there is uncertainty in the actual performance level, and it's not probabilistic in nature, it's really epistemic in nature, then I would say that the short answer here is you can do scenario analysis between extremes. What's your best case performance scenario and worst case scenario? But that is an interesting problem because I wrote this in a recent paper, and I might as well repeat it now. Even the global target for capping the temperature rise is a fuzzy set. The Paris Accord says we would seek to limit global temperature rise by the end of the century to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably closer to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I'm making a point in that paper that this statement is an example of a fuzzy set for which we have many uncertainties, but which will have non-fuzzy implications once it actually plays out in the coming decades. So thanks for that. It's interesting point about uncertainties.
Okay. I have a similar question later on in our chat. But let me go first to Virgilio Meneses. I think he's from DepEd. So he says that this webinar really helps him a lot, and he is an elementary teacher. Can you simplify or give examples of activities for kids to reduce carbon footprint?
Well, for kids, I would, one of the things I remember about elementary school, I think I might have been in the 4th or the 5th grade. We had what is a subject known as work education. And I remember we planted peanuts. So we planted the peanuts and then came back and we would inspect the plants regularly. And at some point we dug up I don't remember if I ate the peanuts eventually, but I remember harvesting. One of the activities I would recommend, because it actually is a form of carbon sequestration, is biochar application to soil. Now, what does that mean? Normally, when you have charcoal, I would have my elementary school students think about this. If they've learned about photosynthesis and they know how charcoal is made, I would just pose initially the thought experiment. You have a lump of charcoal. I would say 75, 80% of that is carbon. I would have them think about where that carbon was before the charcoal was made, before the wood from which the charcoal was made was wood. And eventually they would figure out that through photosynthesis, the carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere went into the plant, into the wood, and eventually you cut down the wood, turn it into charcoal. And what they would have in their hands is actually a lump of carbon that was originally in the atmosphere. And I think kids would be smart enough, at a certain age, they'd be smart enough to understand this. The problem with charcoal is normally we use it for barbecue and such. So you have the carbon which you trapped from the atmosphere, but once you burn that, you're just returning the same carbon as CO2 in the smoke as you make your barbecue. So that goes in a circle if you do it properly. Ask the kids this: if you take that charcoal and pulverize it and then mix it with the soil as if it's compost, what have you done? What you've actually done is you've trapped the same carbon that was originally in the air and put it more or less, for as long as you don't set the soil on fire, then you've actually permanently sequestered carbon and you've achieved negative emissions because you've reversed the flow and taken CO2 from the atmosphere and put it in the ground, rather than the normal positive emissions of taking oil or coal from the ground and burning it and transferring it into the air. So I think that's an interesting thought experiment that you could actually do if in your school you have a plot of land and you can spare a bit of charcoal, and it's completely safe for kids to do as an exercise and as a thinking process and a thought experiment as well, coupled with a physical exercise that they can learn from. to get their hands dirty. So thanks
Okay,
for that.
yeah, thank you for that. I think that was a very good example. Just out of curiosity, the concept of negative emissions technologies, how far back has this concept emerged?
All right. Whose question is that, by the way?
My question.
Man. Oh, okay. Negative emissions. Well, the earliest paper that I could find, I had a quote at the beginning of my talk, and I might as well put that up on screen. I read this in 2017, but this paper was written, okay, this was written before you were born, by Raymond Tan, who's a physicist, but really more of a polymath and all-around intellectual. And the quote goes that there seems to be no law of physics or of ecology that would limit our capacity to rapidly, paraphrasing here, rapidly remove atmospheric CO2 if it becomes an emergency. And back in the 70s, climate change was still generations away from being a global crisis. But now the crisis is actually here. And in the paper, if you don't have time to read the paper, I'll summarize it this way. Raymond Tan calculated the scale of rapid photosynthesis, meaning tree planting, as well as the carbon burying measures that I just talked about. The scale that it would have to be done globally to rapidly absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So he talked about negative emissions, and incidentally, the IPCC refers to it as carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, but they mean the same thing. So the concept of not just reducing emissions, but actually going in the opposite direction, I would attribute it, one of the early proponents was Raymond Tan, who incidentally passed away, I believe it was last year. This is his, I think, one of his most important works.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll go to the question from Vince. Daria, with the advent of new materials, devices, and fuel-efficient or electric cars and engines, has the carbon footprint per person decreased over time, perhaps from 100 years ago?
Hi, Vince, or as you say down there, good day, mate. That's an interesting question. And really, not all countries are progressing at the same, or going through the progress at the same stage of development. So countries, for instance, like India or China or the Philippines are coming late into the game, and are actually, it's these countries for which per capita carbon footprints are growing. And it's simply because unless you have deep changes in the way energy is provided, the carbon footprint really tracks two things. It's the size of the economy and the size of the population. And for example, in the Philippines, if we've been growing, the economy has been growing by about 6-7% per year right up until 2019, the carbon footprint would have been growing at right about the same scale. And then with the population growing at about 2% annually, per capita, that translates to about 4 or 5% increase annually, simply because, of course, nowadays, people have mobile phones and all of these gadgets that need energy. And so that really comes with the rise in level of affluence as countries develop. Now, in countries or regions like the EU, the emissions have been, at least on a per capita basis, leveled off. And in fact, there are serious discussions in Europe and in the UK. And they're really taking their Paris Accord commitment seriously. And as I mentioned, there is a serious initiative in the UK to cut emissions by 2050, which is not too far away in the future. It's about 3 decades away, to have zero emissions in the country by the use of various measures, including negative emissions technologies. So I think just as those developed countries were ahead of us in the temporal carbon curve. In other words, they started producing emissions earlier, tracing back to the Industrial Revolution. I think they're also ahead of the curve in terms of realizing that this is not sustainable, and we have to lead the world in going in the opposite direction. And of course, as I said, I think it's still essential that developing countries like the Philippines, emerging economies like China, should still be participating in that measure, in that effort to cut the emissions in the future as we develop. Because we can't just duplicate exactly the same path that the developed countries have taken.
Okay, I'll take some questions also from the YouTube channel. So we have a couple from Al Serafika. What products can we produce in the Philippines that can have low carbon footprint and be used as a desirable raw material for other foreign manufacturers, perhaps like abaca? The second question is, can you do circular economy for coffee grounds from waste to energy as charcoal substitute?
Thanks, Al. That's an interesting point. And I do think that biomass is very often the underutilized resource. I'll start with an industry I'm familiar with because back in the day, my family was actually involved in coconut oil production when I was in primary school. And I do know by comparison with contacts in Malaysia that we've done side-by-side comparisons between the coconut oil industry at our end and the palm oil industry in Malaysia. Biomass resources are highly underutilized. And I think it is important for us to maximize the use of these resources. The problem is in logistics. And in an analysis, a superficial analysis or the quick analysis of the difference between coconut and palm oil. In palm oil, what happens is you take the palm fruit, the entire palm fruit, and take it to the palm oil mill, and you strip away all of the biomass at the mill, and you're left with the kernels, not the kernels, the components that are actually pressed into the palm oil. But what you've done is you've consolidated the biomass at a point location, and you've solved the logistical problem of having enough biomass to get the economies of scale going. And I have some good friends in the audience who actually been doing plenty of research on utilizing all of this biomass in what are known as biorefineries. Essentially, these are production of substitutes for petroleum and petrochemicals, but based on the biomass. Likewise, some colleagues in New Zealand are looking at using the residues from pulp and paper production, which is very large industry in New Zealand. In the Philippines, I've seen that the problem is the way coconut is processed. And if you're not familiar with this, in the Philippines, what we do is it's in the plantations that we strip away all of the biomass, which is the shell and the husk, and take away what's called the copra, which is the oil-bearing component of the coconut, and ship that, and only that, to the oil mills. And the consequence then is all of the biomass, which is potentially a large energy resource, gets left behind in the plantations and is a dispersed resource. Likewise, the same would happen if you have rice straw residues and so on. So I think biomass is a valuable and underutilized resource. We need to find out intelligent ways to figure out the logistics if the biomass is dispersed to begin with. And as to your question on coffee grounds, this is where you have logistical advantage because the coffee grounds are similar to the palm oil scenario in Malaysia. If you have large companies like Nestle, for example, or Universal Robina Corporation, which makes instant coffee, you would have coffee beans taken to the plants that make the instant coffee, and the grounds have been pre-consolidated and they're in the same location in large quantities. So you would do away with the logistical problem of bringing dispersed biomass resources into a central location. The other way to do this that might potentially work, and I have a paper which is still under review on this, is if you have dispersed biomass resources, perhaps what should be done is to decentralize the utilization of the biomass. For example, through coal firing and power plants. We have plenty of coal-fired power plants. There are manageable technical issues when you start replacing 10-15% of your coal with biomass if it happens to be available in the vicinity. This can be done without any exotic technology, and it's really a matter of logistics. So thanks for that. My short answer in summary is biomass is something we should look to as an important resource.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Edsel Peña, but unfortunately he already had to leave. But I'm sure that he can watch your response on YouTube. So Edsel asks, he's not sure if this is a relevant question, but is the mathematical theory behind pinch analysis the theory of calculus of variations, which is also the basis of optimization problems in statistics, such as most powerful hypothesis tests and also in game theory?
Unfortunately, Edsel, it's a lot simpler than that. Actually, it really boils down to algebra. And one of the most recent proofs available, which we didn't have to reprove it, we just showed that the same problem maps against the problem we were trying to solve, except the streams were different and the quality measures were different. There was a proof published in 2003 by one process integration guru by the name of Mahmoud El-Alwagi of Texas A&M University. Their proof made use of dynamic programming. So it really is based really more on algebraic relationships among the different components of the problem, and not nearly as complex as what you described. So thanks for that, and we can discuss more offline when we see each other.
I have a question from Juiced. So, have you performed sensitivity analysis to model probabilistic source and sink composite curves, which might result in multiple pinch points? What are the implications of such sensitivity analysis in policy making for sustainability?
Just that is a great question. I remember it's something that I talked to Dominic and Mahmoud about almost 2 decades ago, but strangely enough, never published anything on this. But you bring up a good point, because if there is uncertainty in all of those composite curve components and the orientation shifts ever so slightly, the pinch point could actually transfer to a different location, and it upsets the entire solution, because you would then go wrong with all your recommendations about not moving energy from here to there. That's an interesting question. I think that's something we should explore in future research. There is one point I will say about robustness of solutions, and this is where perhaps the hybrid pinch p-graph paper that we had could come into play, because then a non-optimal solution which violates the initial pinch conditions might still be nearly optimal. And if it's a matter of a 1% or 0.1% penalty, maybe the non-optimality is negligible from a practical standpoint. But that is an interesting question. I think I'll need to go back to the drawing board to think about this further.
Okay, I'll take a couple of questions from the YouTube. So one is from Marla Radillas. So she is interested with the quantity and quality of data required for a successful pinch analysis in terms of the accuracy of the output and errors.
Yeah, thanks for that, Marla. My interest has always been the modeling framework, and I brought this up initially, that we need to make a distinction between the modeling framework, which is the template of calculations. It's the procedure that you use to perform the calculations, as opposed to the working model. And my own scientific philosophy for myself is I would see myself as being more scientifically successful if I were to focus my effort on developing the framework and leave the actually pass on the framework to someone who wants to use it and populate it with the proper data. And that said, of course, the accuracy of the results and reliability of the results would depend on the case-specific quality of the data used by the person applying it or the research team applying it, which really means that my concern as a researcher here would be in relation to what Jus Santos mentioned previously, and the question previous to this is, how would I come up with a noise-resistant procedure? And I think I'll do this as my next pet project, something which can be robust to noisy data.
Okay, and then we have a question from Mike Promentelia, also from the YouTube channel.
Okay, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Okay, the next question comes from Mike Promentilla from the YouTube channel. Um, can you extend pinch analysis to apply it for nutrients management, such as phosphorus?
Interesting. Mike Promentilla, of course, my kababayan from Quezon. Of course, he's much nearer to Manila in Sariaya. So hello down there. I hope things are okay in Sariaya. That's an interesting point. And I haven't, tell you the truth, I have not thought of this before, but I would come up with a quick answer now, and that the link lies in the footprint, in the word footprint, because we started out doing the pinch analysis for carbon footprint. 12 years ago, we thought this works for land footprint, water footprint, nitrogen footprint, and really it would not take too much of a leap of faith to get to the point where you're looking at phosphorus footprint. And I know that your research team is doing work on phosphorus footprint. What I would recommend is that because the phosphorus problem is a non-renewable resource problem, as your research team has so often emphasized, I think this might be a workable, at least master's level thesis for a student with the appropriate mindset, someone who's theoretically or computationally inclined and yet understands the phosphorus problem. So I think that's a good idea to work on. If you have a student, I'd be happy to sit in the examination committee and give that person hard questions as well.
Okay, a question from Mark Nalvinus, who is with us here in Zoom. Do we have a model country where there is good practice in terms of regulating carbon emissions?
My opinion is that it's not a particular country, but the European Union and, of course, the country which just recently broke off, the UK, are the countries which are taking their commitments very seriously. In other words, if you look at the laws being put into place and all of the regulations, climate change is taken seriously as a public problem. And that is reflected in their politics, it's reflected in the literature and the research funding that goes into that. Now, there's another country, if you go straight through the earth, through the core and come out on the other side, the other country which I think is a good example is New Zealand. And what New Zealand has done, of course, they're in a bit of a unique situation because New Zealand is a geographically big country, but population-wise is actually the size of a medium-sized city of 4 million people, but spread out over a larger area. So they do have a very low carbon economy when it comes to energy. And one of the interesting features that they have is because they have plenty of renewables, geothermal and hydroelectric, and livestock agriculture is a major part of their economy. It's gotten to the point where methane emissions from agriculture are actually a major problem. And when they look at their greenhouse gas footprint, it's much more worrying than fossil fuel combustion. Whereas in most countries, it's the reverse. It's dominated primarily by combustion, and then agricultural emissions would be secondary. In New Zealand, it's disproportionate compared to the rest of the world.
Thank you for that. Joel Coelho actually has a comment also regarding that particular issue. So he says that Denmark also qualifies as such a model. Okay, but I won't go into the details of the comment. Just a few more comments from the YouTube. Al Serafika has asked, can you specifically use pinch analysis for cure and vaccine allocation since it is important in the near future?
Al, we should have a serious discussion, and we have a meeting later today at 2 p.m., so we could spend 5-10 minutes on this. But let me just say, this is exactly the problem because it's a supply chain problem. Dominic and I started to work on this already, and it's top secret, but if you have ideas, we'd be happy to have a third co-author with us, with all your bright ideas anyway. So let's talk about that and actually come up with something. Because Dominic and I sort of set that aside in a bookshelf somewhere, put it in storage for a month. Let's revive that.
It seems that you will be having a lot of projects after this particular talk. So there are more details also and comments from Dr. Joel Coelho in our chat box, including a link to We Forum on how Europe can become more heat efficient, and another comment from Al Serafica with regards to is it true that planting mangroves along the coastline is good for carbon sequestration?
In general, photosynthesis is good for carbon sequestration. So there's nothing magical specifically about any specific species of trees, whether you talk about, say, mangroves or coconuts or malunggay or uh, nara or whatever. The general principle is as a plant grows, it takes up, elementary school kids are taught this. As a plant grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide, and the amount of carbon in the body of the plant is exactly the amount of carbon that was removed from the atmosphere. What we need to think about, and I think it's good to drive home this point, because unless you really think about the scientific basis for all of this, it's tempting to think that there's something magical about plants when they absorb CO2. What actually happens is, as the plants mature to the point where they stop growing, the material balance tells you that once a plant or a tree stops growing and hits maturity, it actually begins to decline in its carbon sequestration. And this needs to be understood. In other words, if we were to embark, and I would recommend then that you read the Freeman Dyson paper for more of this. If you were to reforest, as the forest grows, it would have massive carbon dioxide uptake. Once the forest reaches steady state where the die-off of the trees matches the plant growth, so it's actually not expanding anymore, then there is no net carbon uptake. This is why you would need to supercharge the system by doing things like biomass burial or biochar sequestration, which are measures by which you can augment the natural photosynthesis so that it doesn't taper off as it normally would. Now, regarding the many projects comments, I would also advertise that I've been pretty creative about using pinch analysis principles for various problems. I have a couple of papers on pinch analysis for human resource allocation. In other words, if you have tasks to do and you have only so many hours, man hours of resource available to handle the tasks, there are ways to optimize, and I do use that for myself. One of the reasons I'm able to do what I do is because I am a pinch researcher, in the sense that I use exactly the same allocation principles for myself. So
Okay, so
thanks for that.
I'd be interested in reading that particular paper to help me manage my time. Okay, I think we've exhausted our questions. Do you have any final thoughts, final words, Dr. Tan, for our audience?
Well, I would just, thanks for that, by the way. Thanks, Kay, and thanks for all of you who've sent in your interesting questions and stimulating suggestions. I think, again, COVID is the crisis of the moment. But I would venture to say that in 3 years' time, COVID would be a thing of the past. In 3 years' time, climate change will still be here as an issue. In 3 decades' time, it would still be an issue. And the IPCC always speaks of 2100 as the reckoning point for all the targets. But actually, climate change will not stop in 2100. It will continue thereafter. So our descendants will grapple with the damage that has been done by the present and past generations. I would just hope that we exert plenty of research effort and energy into addressing this issue with a lot more focus and a lot more commitment to it, in the same manner that we've responded to COVID. COVID was a crisis that emerged very rapidly and galvanized the public and the scientific community in response. It hasn't happened to climate change because it's a slow creeping crisis that is easy to overlook. But with this webinar this morning, I hope that I've stimulated bright minds in the audience to think of how they, as scientists and researchers, or as educators, can help us solve this problem, because no single person and no single university or research team can solve this, but it can be solved by an integrated global effort.
Okay, thank you for that. But before we end this webinar, let me just plug the next webinar. Okay, so please bear with me. Okay, so I hope you can already see my screen. Okay, so next week we will be having Dr. Rodel Barrientos, and he will discuss a potential vaccine against fentanyl and related analogs. So Rodel is from the U.S. Military HIV Research Program at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation for the Advancement of Military Medicine. He is also currently the program chair and vice president of the Washington Chromatography Discussion Group. So for those who are interested, please don't forget to register at tinyurl.com/rbarrientos. In addition to that, I would like to plug that the PAASE will be having its 40th PAASE anniversary and 2020 annual PAASE meeting and symposium from July 20 all the way to August 14. So there will be sessions and discussions all day, every week, from Mondays to Fridays, from 8 to 10 a.m. Philippine Standard Time. So we are currently accepting papers wherein the deadline will be on July 5. So for those interested, please go to our website, paase.org, for details. So if you scan the QR code over there, it will take you right away to our website. And abstract guidelines can be found at shorturl.at/ylpsu. And you may send in your abstracts to paasemanila2020@gmail.com. So we are also present on Facebook. We have our official PAASE page on Facebook, our website at paase.org, and all our webinars will be recorded and uploaded in the YouTube channel. Oh, in addition to that, I wanted to inform everyone that next week's webinar will not be recorded as requested by our speakers. So I hope you won't miss that, especially if you're interested in the topic, because it will only be available during the time of the session. So that's it. That ends my my session. So thank you very much, everyone. So if there are no more questions, if there are no more questions and comments, thank you for joining us this morning, and I hope you can join us again next week. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thank you, Raymond. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Joe.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.